Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. What do last week's economic results reveal about the true state of the economy and what further steps are necessary? Those are two key issues I shall raise today with the Managing Director of Kotak Mahindra Asset Management and a part-time member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Nilesh Shah. Mr. Shah, however, will be speaking us today in his personal capacity. Mr. Shah, let's start with the economic figures released last week, which show that the economy during the first quarter of this financial year has shrunk by 23.9%. In an article that he wrote for the Economic Times yesterday, Raghuram Rajan says this is alarming. How do you view the outcome?
Undoubtedly, our economy, like global economy, is caught in the perfect storm. There is medical crisis brewing. This has resulted into economic disruptions, creating economic crisis, which in turn has resulted into financial crisis. Never ever in the history of our independence country, we have ever faced three crises like medical, economic and financial together. And obviously, the 24% plus drop in the GDP is an alarming thing, and we must pull all these socks together to create this crisis into an opportunity like 1991 FX crisis.
Let me pick up on some of the results that were announced last Monday. From your standpoint, which are the most worrying? The fact that construction has shrunk by 50%, hotels, trade and transport by 47%, manufacturing by 39%, all of which together show that production is badly down? Or are you more worried by the collapse of private consumption, which accounts for something like 57-58% of GDP, and this has shrunk by something like 27%, suggesting that demand is badly down? Which of the two worries you more?
So I'm not worried about first quarter GDP data. We enforced one of the strictest lockdown in the world. It was a question of lives over livelihoods. If we had not taken that step, the number of cases which we are witnessing in August, we would have probably witnessed in April. Now this is water under the bridge. We can't reverse the past. As I mentioned earlier, we need to convert this crisis into opportunities. There are many structural and cyclical reforms which we can do to ensure that we come out stronger out of this crisis rather than weaker.
I want very much to talk about the reforms that you have in mind, but before I come to that, so that the audience can understand, let's talk a little bit more about the state of the economy. After that, I'll come to the reforms. Now, you began your answer by saying you're not worried by the first quarter GDP results. Does that mean you disagree with Raghuram Rajan, who says they are alarming?
No. I don't disagree at all with Dr. Raghuram Rajan. He is the tallest economist in the world today. And the number of 23.9% contraction in GDP is definitely alarming. But this is water under the bridge. In 91 crisis, we could have cried saying that, oh, we just have 14 days of FX reserves left. We have to go and pledge our gold. And this is end of world for us. We didn't take that approach. We took corrective action. And today we have $540 billion of reserves. From that day onwards, we didn't have to ever worry about our FX crisis. So like we settled our FX crisis of the 90s by taking structural and cyclical reforms, why not convert this crisis into an opportunity?
Absolutely, that I fully understand. But let me for a moment stick with this crisis and I'll come to the reforms that are necessary thereafter. Now, as you know, there is a considerable debate about whether the results announced last week accurately reflect what's happening in the unorganized sector or whether they underestimate it. Both Raghuram Rajan and the former chief statistician Pranab Sen have gone on record to say that the unorganized sector has been underestimated. But writing in the Economic Times, Vivek Debroy, who's the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has said there is no underestimation. What's your view? Has there been underestimation of the unorganized sector, or is that a mistaken view?
So the fact remains that today we are all grasping in the dark about unorganized sector. The data errors would have crept in because of the lockdown. and hence we have taken an estimation. Now, whether it's underestimation or overestimation, time will tell. But as of today, clearly minus 23.9% itself is an alarming thing, and that should push us to take corrective action.
So you do agree that what we have of the unorganized sector in these figures is an estimation, and that estimation could be correct, but it could be an underestimation as well. We just don't know.
Absolutely.
Let's then at this point focus on three specific sectors and their situation today. And I'll begin with MSMEs, which, as you know, are 30% of GDP, 45% of manufacturing, 50% of exports, and some people say they employ perhaps as many as 12 crore people. Now, on August the 19th, the MSME ministry revealed that 74% of MSMEs are using less than 50% of their capacity. Would you therefore agree that this is one sector that continues to be in serious trouble?
Undoubtedly, MSMEs as a sector is undercapitalized, and they have probably not invested into technology as much as their larger counterpart. And clearly, we need to support our MSME sector, which is a large portion of our economy. But at the same time, we must support which is the stronger part of the MSMEs. In the nature, the weaker has to die. Similarly, in business, we should not make the mistake of supporting wrong business model. That creates much higher cost to the economy at a later date. So we need to distinguish in terms of those MSMEs which can be revived by providing financial support, those MSMEs which requires financial as well as technical support, and those MSMEs whose business model is based on tax arbitrage or exploiting inefficiencies of the system, they probably need to be not supported at all.
This is a very interesting, hard-headed answer you're giving me, that we need to clearly distinguish between those MSMEs which can be revived and therefore should be supported, and those that cannot be revived and allowed them to die. There is no point, in other words, in throwing good money after bad MSMEs and keeping failures alive.
Absolutely. Economy, if you see in Mumbai, there are one side textile mills which are owned by government through National Textiles Corporation, and other side are textiles mills which has been converted into shopping malls, into leisure complexes, into residential complexes. Now, despite putting tons of money in those mills and supporting them, they have actually become a drag on the economy. On the other hand, by allowing closure of textile mills, recreating them in terms of residential complexes, malls, leisure complexes, we have added value to the economy. This is the law of the nature. Why should we, go against the nature of the market? Let the weak shut down on its own. Let that capital employed be converted into something better, and that's how economy grows. I just want to take one incidence from American history in 1929, Great Depression. In those days, in American house, the second most important asset after house was piano. Everyone was having piano at home. There were companies which were manufacturing piano. There were piano teachers, piano tuition classes, piano repairing classes, logistics companies moving piano, and so on and so forth. In Great Depression, when income crashed, there was no need for piano. When you put your piano into market, there was no secondary market. And this resulted into dramatic collapse of piano industry. Hundreds of thousands of workers, tuition teachers, coaching classes, repairers shut down. And American government didn't support them. They just allowed it to crash. It was short-term pain, but over a period of time, allowing that weaker part of economy to shut down has ensured that American economy over the years became the world's largest economy.
That's a very interesting example that you're giving us, and certainly, even though you haven't put it in those terms, there is advice there for our economic planners that there are sectors of the economy that have outlived their utility. Times have changed, fashions have changed, let them die. Do not throw money to revive them. something else will take its place, and the economy will continue. In that context, therefore, let me come to a second sector of the economy, the financial sector. Now, in its recent financial stability report, the RBI had said that NPAs, non-performing assets, could increase possibly up to 14.7%. Pranab Sen, the chief statistician, told me just about 4 days ago that he believes all Mudra loans have by now become NPAs. And I know that the Kamath committee is working out guidelines for restructuring loans. But how worried are you about the health of the financial sector?
So clearly there will be increase in NPAs. As moratorium ends, as restructuring is given, this may not be coming onto the surface, but the ability of industry and MSME and retail to service their existing debt definitely has come under pressure post-COVID-19. There's no debate about it. Now, creating NPAs is not a bad thing. What we have to focus upon is the resolution. There was a time when in US it was said that whatever is good for General Motors is good for America. It was the American icon. In 2008 crisis, they had no shame in putting that into bankruptcy. And within 6 months, GM was restructured. The insolvency was taken out. And today GM is back as a functioning company. Our problem is that we prefer to sweep NPS below carpet. We didn't go after promoters who have swindled money, who have gold-plated their companies and created NPS. A NPA coming out of genuine business failure is part and parcel of business cycle. No country can avoid it. But we must ensure that those promoters who have taken money out of their company and created deliberate NPS, they should be punished and they should be made to compensate for the NPS which they have created. We can't allow a system where promoters don't become bankrupt, but companies continue to become bankrupt. What we need is a faster, swifter resolution of NPS.
But once again, you're saying something which is almost radical in India. Just as you said, we must not protect and preserve bad MSMEs, let them fail. Similarly, you're saying we cannot continue to sweep NPAs under the carpet, and we must go after promoters who have deliberately taken money out, enriched themselves personally, but collapsed their companies. They must be not just pursued, but prosecuted and brought to justice, because only then will this problem of swindling be tackled. You're being very hard-headed about this. I applaud you, because this sort of hard-headedness is very rare. Let me, in that context, bring up a third sector of the Indian economy, and this time, paradoxically, it's agriculture. Now, that's one sector, the only one, in fact, that has grown in the last quarter. It's grown by 3.4%. But I noticed that agricultural GVA, which in quarter one of last year was 8.6%, is only 5.7 in quarter one of this year. And Pranab Sen says this is a clear sign that farmers' incomes have not commensurately risen. And he believes that we face a fairly serious problem of farmers' distress down the road. Do you share that concern?
So on the agriculture side, it classically displays what is wrong with Indian policy making. And I will call it Bhishma Pitama syndrome. If you read Mahabharata, Bhishma Pitama was epitome of righteousness, but he always looked at his responsibilities, his duties from a very narrow prism point of view. He had to be loyal to the Hastinapur crown. It didn't matter whether the king was doing right thing or not. This is the real issue of Indian policy making, and I'll explain you in a very interesting incident. If you remember, few years ago, there was an incident in parking lot of Delhi which was dark, and it happened in an automobile which unfortunately had dark films. And then a kind-hearted soul in Kolkata filed a writ petition in Supreme Court saying that because of those dark films, that unfortunate incidents occurred. Supreme Court read the Motor Vehicles Act, and unfortunately in Motor Vehicles Act, it was written, which was drafted many years back, that you can't affix anything to the window of the car. A plastic film which was affixed to the window of the car or an automobile was not legal under the Motor Vehicles Act. and Supreme Court followed the law. Their intention was to stop the unfortunate incidences. What was the consequences? We were affixing this film so as to save load on air conditioner of the car because of the heat in country. By shutting down fixing of those films, we are spending roughly about 10,000 crore every year for additional import of fuel. And this is just assuming 5 months of summer, and we all know how many months of summer in India we have. Second, in 1.5 crore automobiles, we had to remove those films. Average 20,000 rupee per car per film, you lost 30,000 crore rupees to individual customers. There were companies which were making those films, many of them shut down, 5,000-6,000 crore of NPS. There were mechanics which were dependent upon those film fixing, and they lost their job in business. Finally, what did we achieve out of this interpretation of law? We are spending money on fuel, we lost money on fixing of films, we lost businesses, we lost employment. And has those unfortunate incidences stopped? Answer is no, because you can still put a curtain on your window, you can have dark glasses. All you need was to interpret law in a manner where transparent films could have been allowed to affix. That would have saved the entire economic consequences. Now, the sad part of this story is that we have a company called Garware Polyester, which makes these films and exports to 80 countries around the world, 80. But it can't sell those films in India. This is the Bhishma Pitama syndrome. Everyone trying to do dharma in a narrow prism, we need to take a bigger view. And that is applicable in agriculture also.
But translate the Bhishma Pitama syndrome into agriculture and explain that a bit more, because this is tantalizing. The story you tell has been clearly understood by everyone, but they can't perhaps work out how does it apply to agriculture. So give me a concrete example and apply the Bhishma Pitama syndrome to agriculture.
So Netherlands is a country where half the land is below the sea level. It's a size which is smaller than Gujarat or Maharashtra or Rajasthan. Their agriculture export is $80 billion. In India, our agriculture exports are just about $25 billion. Clearly, there is something amiss in our agriculture sector. And what are the things? One, we have ensured that agriculture remains a family-driven enterprise rather than a professional enterprise, because acquisition of land is not possible for a corporate or for an individual unless until he is a farmer. Second, our fertilizer subsidy is structured in a manner where people are over-consuming urea and under-consuming potassium and nitrate. Now this changes the quality of land and it has a direct impact on your output. Third, despite seeing success of hybrid variety on cotton, we have the GMO variety in cotton, we have not introduced GMO in other seeds. We allow import of food items which are made of GMO products, but we don't allow production of GMO products in our country for a variety of reasons. Then comes, the agriculture power subsidy. Now, in few states, we have allowed agriculture power to be priced at market and provided assured supply. In few states, agriculture power is heavily subsidized, and clearly people are using agriculture power for other purposes and still getting those subsidy. In turn, quality of power suffers, or money gets invested into DISCOM by way of subsidy, which otherwise could have been used for healthcare or any other item. If all this was not good enough, then we have restrictions through APMC, where farmer is pushed to sell his product only in certain mandi, where intermediaries do take advantage. If you look at the mandi pricing over a period of time, whenever supply increases, which is normally when farmers are selling, prices are subdued. And whenever farmer selling is over and traders are selling, prices are generally higher. Then there is a question of wastage. An apple will cost about 25 or 30 paisa in Himachal Pradesh. But the same thing when it comes to Mumbai or Chennai or Kolkata, will probably cost 15 or 20 rupees. A lot of it is attributable to wastages. 30 to 40% of agriculture produce gets wasted in absence of cold storage, in absence of proper facility. Now put all these things together, despite subsidizing agriculture, we have not been able to increase income of the farmer. We have not been able to provide them remunerative prices. And overall, these wastages and leakages are actually taking away large portion of our resources.
That is a fascinating, eye-opening, comprehensive answer. I thank you for it, Mr. Shah. Many people will have had their attitude to agriculture almost revolutionized by that answer. You certainly opened eyes. I want very quickly to take you through how you see the next 3 quarters and then come to what I know you want to talk about, the necessary reform measures that ought to be implemented so that this crisis can become an opportunity. But let's first talk about quarter 2. So far, we've been talking about quarter 1. Quarter 2 is July, August, September. Now, the RBI's annual report has accepted that the green shoots we saw in May and June shriveled in July, August, probably because of the random lockdowns declared by various states. As a result, GST in August was 12% lower than GST in August last year. But on the other hand, the purchasing managers index has gone above 50 for the first time since COVID hit us. And clearly, automobile sales are booming, particularly Maruti sales. So how do you see the economy performing in quarter 2?
So our estimation is that second quarter GDP growth will still be negative, obviously far lower than the first quarter. There are certain segments of economy where activity levels have started reaching previous year level. Fertilizer, telecom, power, food processing, pharma and healthcare, automobiles to some extent, tractors. It will be fair to summarize that semi-urban and rural economy seems to be nearing previous year level. On the other hand, there are sectors like hotel, tourism, travel, aviation, which are still under pressure, and activity level there is substantially below previous year level. So second quarter GDP will still be a negative number, though substantially lower than the first quarter.
You want to put a figure? How much lower? Is it minus 9, 10, 12? That's the range people talk about.
I hope it is in lower single digit, but somewhere it will be in single digit, not in double digit.
In single digits, not in double digits. Now, let me put one problem on the horizon that seems to get bigger with every single day. Recovery from quarter 1 to quarter 2 is happening at the same time as the COVID cases seems to be accelerating. As you know, we are increasing it now over 90,000 cases a day. Professor Ashish Jha of Harvard has said to me that he believes India could have a total of 200 million cases by Diwali, both the reported as well as the unreported ones. And as yet, we have no idea when we are going to hit our peak. How does this health crisis impact on our faltering recovery?
Undoubtedly, health crisis is the biggest question mark on the recovery. And here we need adoption of South Korean / Japanese model, where public and private hygiene is playing an important role in controlling the spread of the disease. Clearly, we need social distancing, we need wearing of masks, we need washing of hands. These are absolutely necessary to ensure that we are able to contain this spread. And we have to really balance between lives and livelihoods. Our healthcare infrastructure is not comparable to Western world, and which means there is extra responsibility on all of us to ensure that we do everything possible to contain the spread.
In which case, how do you see quarter 3 and quarter 4? I'll collapse them into one question. Will the single digit decline that you see in quarter 2 continue in quarter 3 and again into quarter 4? Or do you think we could see growth perhaps in 3, more certainly in 4?
So lot of factors will come into play. Will we get a standard medical protocol which brings down fertility rate pretty low, and that gives space to government and industry to resume normal economic activity? Will we get vaccine? Will people follow, public and private hygiene? So third and fourth quarter will be entirely depend upon how this medical situation pans out. If medical situation remains under control, there is a reasonably good chance that by fourth quarter, we will be into positive GDP growth.
Which suggests that you think quarter three will still be negative.
Yes, it will be lower than second quarter, but it could still be negative.
So when we get to the end of this financial year, when we come to the 31st of March 2021, how much will the economy have shrunk during this financial year as a whole?
It will be higher single digit for entire FY 2021.
Higher single digit, you mean it will have shrunk around 7-8%?
Between 5 to 9%.
That's quite a range, between 5 to 9%.
Because a lot will depend upon what happens in second half in terms of medical solution. A worsening medical situation undoubtedly will push it towards higher number. A controlled medical situation will undoubtedly push towards lower range.
A lot depends, and you've said this twice, on what happens in terms of the medical situation, but very few people believe we will have a vaccine before the end of the year. Most likely estimates is that it will probably be somewhere between March and June of next year. So that means that the medical uncertainty will continue and the number of cases will continue to grow. Our positive thing is that our fatality rate is very, very low. But the number of cases could keep growing because we have a huge population. So that sort of medical situation, does it suggest we'll come in closer to 9 rather than 5?
If fatality rate is down and it gives space for economic activity to resume normally, then we should be still between 5 to 7. But if fatality rate is low and we are still not able to resume normal economic activity for a variety of reasons, then it is quite likely to be upwards of 7 to 9.
Okay, that is very, very clear. Thank you very much. Let's take a break at that point. When I come back, Mr. Shah, I want to turn to that subject that you raised yourself. Given the background that you sketched out, what do you believe are the steps the government needs to take? And how quickly should they be taken? We'll be back in a moment's time, but first, a little break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is the Managing Director of Kotak Mahindra Asset Management and a part-time member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, speaking, however, today in his personal capacity, Nilesh Shah. Mr. Shah, against the background of the state of the economy and how you see the next 3 quarters up till the end of the financial year, let me ask you, is there a need for further immediate fiscal stimulus? And if the answer is yes, how large should it be?
Undoubtedly, there is a need for fiscal stimulus because there are so many industries which has been hit hard by COVID-19. The size of the stimulus has to be determined based on what is the need of the economy rather than what is the resource availability of the government. And I think we will be able to raise necessary resources. If you don't do anything and GDP contracts, then your fiscal deficit, your debt to GDP ratio automatically will go up. We might as well do something, expand the denominator and maintain same level of GDP and debt to GDP ratio.
You said 2 very important things which I'm repeating so that the audience don't miss them. Undoubtedly, we need a fiscal stimulus. But as important, you said the size is to be determined by the need of the economy, not by the resource capacity of the government. That clearly suggests, doesn't it, that you're envisaging the government allowing the fiscal deficit to increase and perhaps very substantially.
No, there is no need to expand fiscal deficit very substantially. And let me give you an example. In this century, 20 years, we have imported $376 billion of gold on a net import basis. This is excluding gold smuggling, which is a reality. This is excluding all that gold which travelers wear when they come back to India. If we take rough number, that gold import is roughly about $500 billion. World Gold Council estimates that we have 25,000 tons of gold in household. value of that will be close to $2 trillion today. Now, this gold is lying in Tijori, in black account. How do we bring this gold into white economy? If we can come out with a good amnesty scheme, government gets revenue, the SME enterprises, businessmen gets white capital in their balance sheet against which banks can lend. That automatically creates investments, that automatically creates growth. And more importantly, if this gold is bought by RBI, they are able to expand balance sheet by investing into gold, which rating agencies will be acceptable, which will be acceptable to rating agencies. Thus, by creating a gold amnesty scheme, we are able to raise resources for the government. We are able to bring equity capital in the economy, in the business balance sheets. We are probably asking for a rating upgrade as RBI purchases this gold and expands the balance sheet. So this is one way to raise resources without expanding fiscal deficit. The other way to raise this is by monetizing assets of the government. You know that there is Custodian of Enemy Property Act. These are 9,400 odd properties of people who were living in India and migrated to Pakistan at the time of independence. The market value of this property is more than 1 lakh crore. Today it is lying unutilized, probably encroached. If we can clean up this and put that asset into monetization, we are able to raise 100,000 crore. What better time than today to raise that capital? The third thing is divestment. We have been doing market divestment. Every time you are constant seller in the market, that keeps PSU share prices under pressure. And that has ensured that PSU stocks are today available at valuation or market cap substantially lower than what they were 10, 15 years back. Now, if we can go for strategic divestment, we can get better prices, and that appreciation which happens on the strategic divestment side could be utilized for funding your fiscal deficit. If you take this kind of steps of asset monetization, gold amnesty scheme, and strategic divestment rather than market divestment, you will be able to raise resources necessary for funding your expenditure, for funding fiscal stimulus need of the economy without expanding fiscal deficit by a big margin.
Very quickly, just for clarity, when you talk about strategic divestment, you really mean privatization, don't you?
Absolutely. I'll give you an example of Hindustan Zinc Limited. It got privatized or strategically divested in 2001. At the time of divestment, it was making about 100,000 tons of zinc, and it was loss-making entity taking support from the exchequer. Today, they make about 1.6 million tons of zinc, 16 times up in last 20 years, and they contribute by way of royalties, cess, taxes, and dividend about 10,000 crore to the economy. One company ensured that when it moved from government hand to private hand, it created tremendous value for the economy. Imagine if you can do this with multiple sets of companies and they all turn out to be like Hindustan Zinc. Instead of taking support from the exchequer, they will be supporting exchequer.
This is perfectly clear. And in a sense, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has talked about fairly extensive privatization when in May she announced her 5 days of policy changes and proposals for the future. The problem is this government's track record on privatization is pretty poor. We bungled Air India, and the rest of the time privatization seems to be a question of selling one PSU to another. The only government that has actually done privatization effectively was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Since then, Indian governments have not had the political courage to bite the bullet. Do you think at this moment of crisis that courage is there?
I think crisis does allow us to take radical reforms. We saw that in 1991 FX crisis when we opted the path of liberalization. Now clearly economy today is in tough situation and we need to take all those corrective steps which are necessary. I think people are smart. If explained to them correctly, they will happily reciprocate and approve strategic divestment stroke privatization. At the end of the day, when economy expands, everyone benefits.
what you're saying, although you haven't said it, is that if economic advisors can explain to ministers the need for such steps, those ministers will accept it. A lot then depends upon how the economic advice given to the government is presented and how convincingly the argument is made. I'm sure you're right. Let me move to a second issue, and that is to do with if there is to be a fiscal stimulus, what should it focus on? Should it focus on infrastructure, roads, bridges, etc.? Should it focus on those industries that have been crippled by the lockdown, aviation, hotels, construction, tourism, retail trade? Or should it focus on direct transfers to the tens or maybe hundreds of millions who've lost their jobs to boost their demand?
So I think there is no one size fit that all kind of solution possible. The government will have to tackle needs of every sector and every segment of economy. Obviously, they have to prioritize in terms of what is value to the economy. And the objective should be to create a multiple effect. Now, for example, when you support construction activity, it has far more multiple effect through consumption of steel, cement, labor employment, and so on and so forth. Infrastructure development also has multiple effect as it kind of improves productivity and efficiency in the economy. At the same time, there will be sectors which will require some sort of support. So one will have to take a case specific approach. There are some sectors which requires financial support. There are some which requires financial plus technical or structural support. There are some sectors which requires indirect support in the form of direct benefit transfer to their consumer, and that demand revival will ensure that they are back in business. So we'll have to take far more bottom up case specific approach rather than taking a call from the top down of throwing money.
That I understand. One last question, and it's to do with the timing of the fiscal deficit, because different voices coming from the government suggest very different timeframes. In July on the 23rd, speaking to FICCI, the chief economic advisor said the right time for a fiscal stimulus would be when a vaccine is available. In August, speaking to PTI, the expenditure secretary said the right time will be when the infections diminish and when psychological fears disappear. And then just a couple of days ago, Vivek Debroy, the chairman of your Economic Advisory Commission, said that in fact the right time would be unlock 5, which presumably means October. What's your feeling? When is the right time for this fiscal stimulus?
So in a sense, all of them are saying is right, because fiscal stimulus is not like a one-time solution. Each industry has different need. Some problems can be solved by monetary stimulus, which is provision of liquidity, provision of credit, and lowering of interest rate. Some can be resolved through opening up of economy or improving ease of doing business. Some needs demand revival. Now, when you're trying to revive demand, you have to ensure that your fiscal stimulus goes in at the right time. Otherwise, inflation will pick up as demand goes up with the support, but supply is not meeting the required demand. And finally, there will be certain industries which will require, financial support or fiscal support. So this is not something which is like plug and play. You have to constantly evaluate situation and take appropriate action. At the same time, your fiscal stimulus will also be dependent upon how you are able to raise resources. So it's a kind of complex things which is requiring day-to-day monitoring and day-to-day solution.
Your answer reminds me of what Raghuram Rajan wrote in the Economic Times yesterday. He made a distinction between relief and stimulus. And as he pointed out, if relief is not given to a dying patient, the patient will die and there'll be no need for stimulus. You need, therefore, to keep the patient alive through relief, and then when things begin to pick up, you need to give stimulus to boost demand. Would you accept that this distinction between relief and stimulus is a sensible one? And if you do believe it's sensible, do you believe that the government needs to do more at the relief stage?
Definitely, the definition of relief and stimulus by Dr. Rajan is very comprehensive. And I just want to draw the experience again back of National Textile Corporation, where whether we call it relief, stimulus, or a bailout, that entire capital went into a business which was dying, which was not competitive. It did protect mill workers' jobs at that point of time, but it ended up creating far bigger drain on the economy. The relief should go obviously towards all the needy, but stimulus should go towards all those businesses who will be competitive going forward, who will not be a drag on the economy.
But then you are saying something very important, and again, I'm spelling it out. You haven't spelled it out yourself. You're saying the danger about giving relief to every patient who is ill in an equal fashion is that you might keep alive some that actually would be best allowed to die. We need to be very discriminatory in who we give relief to and who we deny. Do not, once again, to use that phrase, throw good money behind bad projects.
Absolutely.
You've been extremely clear, Mr. Shah. I'm extremely grateful for this interview. I have to point out that I don't think I've interviewed someone who's spoken so openly. And although you have made me say, and I say quite happily, that you're speaking in your personal capacity, I really hope your colleagues on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, as well as the ministers and bureaucrats in that ministry, listen to you. Because this is the first time I've heard someone present in a very comprehensive but easy for laymen to understand fashion precisely what needs to be done, and most importantly, how that fiscal stimulus can be paid for. The idea of a gold amnesty scheme is one that I've heard for the first time. No one else has ever said it. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Take care. Stay safe.
Karan, if you give me 5 minutes, I just want to convey a message to people. It's not the government, it's also the people which are responsible for the economic situation of a country. And I'll give you an example. When US went into depression in 1929, their dollar was linked to gold. So unless until you have gold, you can't print dollar. And to buy gold, you needed dollars. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, the then president in 1933, without consulting opposition leader, without consulting parliament, without consulting anyone, simply nationalized all the gold owned by Americans at below market value. There was a huge penalty of $10,000 and 10 years imprisonment if you keep gold with you. Entire American gold was bought below market value by US Fed, and that's where they are the largest owner of gold in the world in the central banking sector. That gold bought below market value allowed them to print dollar, that allowed them to raise resources to fund spending, and eventually American economy come out of the trouble. No American, and now American women don't wear Mangal Sutra, but no American men complain that you are removing our golden ring. They happily gave that, or they were fearful of punishment, but they complied. Now look at India. We were post-independence going through FX crisis. In 1962 war with China, we didn't have money to buy socks for our soldiers who were fighting on mountains. 1965 war with Pakistan created further drain on our economy. At that point of time, then Finance Minister Morarji Desai come out with a Gold Control Act. It just requested Indians that please don't buy gold more than certain quantity. It requested jewelers not to keep gold beyond certain quantity. We didn't nationalize gold. We just requested for holding gold not beyond certain level, and they were quite generous level. The entire population, went into black marketing of gold, gold smuggling. The entire gold trade partially moved into black economy. Everyone worked together to defeat noble objective of Morarji Desai. And as a country, we have paid a huge price. Today, no wonder gold prices have gone up and our value of gold holdings have also appreciated. But imagine spending $376 billion in import of gold. That money has gone out of country. We have gone with a bowl to rest of the world for bringing foreign direct investment, but we are actually spending more money outside in import of gold than what foreign direct investment we receive. As a poor nation, we can't afford this. Clearly, there is a lesson between American history and Indian history. If we support our government, every crisis can be converted into opportunity and we will come out of this nicely.
There's a very cleverly presented message there. This is one opportunity where we need to behave more like the American people did in the early 30s and not like the way we behaved when Morarji Desai presented the Gold Act. But the important thing is this: Roosevelt came out with a New Deal as well. Has our government sketched out a New Deal? Many would say no. There were two parts to what happened in America: the enormous sacrifice made by the American people. You quoted the gold story, but there was the flip side, the New Deal, which pushed America to levels of economic growth and prosperity which were not imaginable in the 20s and 30s. We need our Roosevelt. But I thank you for this interview. In many ways, it's riveting and eye-opening. And as I said, take care, stay safe.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.